A routine traffic stop takes a shocking turn when a racist cop pulls over a black man, assuming he's just another suspect. With an aggressive attitude and no questions asked, the officer slaps on the cuffs. But here's the twist. This isn't just any man. He's a high-ranking CIA agent with the power to turn this officer's life upside down. The moment the truth comes out, everything changes. Careers are at risk, reputations are on the line, and what happens next will leave you speechless. How does a simple arrest escalate into a full-blown nightmare for the cop? And what does the CIA agent do in response? Stay tuned, because this story will shock you to your core. It was supposed to be just another day for Officer James, a routine patrol, looking for so-called suspicious activity. But when he spotted a black man in an expensive suit driving a luxury car, his biases took over. Without hesitation, he pulled him over, assuming the worst. What he didn't know was that he had just arrested someone who could end his career with a single phone call. This wasn't just any man. He was a top CIA agent. And what happened next would change both of their lives forever. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. It's a story of power, justice, and an officer who let his prejudice cloud his judgment. What happens when a man who enforces the law wrongfully arrests someone who creates the law? The confrontation that follows is nothing short of explosive. Will the officer face consequences? Will the CIA agent seek revenge or teach him a lesson he'll never forget? Stick around, because this real-life twist will leave you stunned until the very last second. Officer James had been patrolling the city for years, but today, he was in a particularly bad mood. His shift had been uneventful, and he hated slow days. He wanted action, something that made him feel like a real cop. And then, he saw it. A sleek black Mercedes stopped at a red light. The driver was a black man, sharply dressed, with an air of confidence that James didn't like. To him, it didn't add up. A car like that? In this neighborhood? His gut told him something was off, and in his mind, his gut was never wrong. Without hesitation, he flicked on his lights and siren, signaling the car to pull over. The driver, Michael Davis, noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and sighed. Not again, he thought. As a high-ranking CIA agent, Michael had been trained for all kinds of situations: terror threats, hostage negotiations, deep cover missions. But there was one thing even his years of elite training hadn't shielded him from: racial profiling. Michael pulled over smoothly, keeping both hands on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. The last thing he wanted was to give the officer any excuse to escalate the situation. He watched as James approached, his hand resting dangerously close to his holstered gun. The look on the officer's face wasn't one of professionalism. It was one of power. James tapped on the window aggressively. License and registration. Michael rolled down the window and met the officer's gaze calmly. "Good afternoon, officer. Can I ask why I was pulled over?" James smirked. "Because I said so. License and registration now?" Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his frustration in check. He reached for his wallet and retrieved his ID and registration, handing them over without a word. James barely glanced at them before stuffing them into his pocket. "Step out of the vehicle." Michael hesitated. "Is there a reason for that?" James' patience snapped. "Because I told you to. Or do you want to make this harder on yourself?" Michael clenched his jaw. This guy has no idea who he's dealing with. But he also knew that resisting, even verbally, could make things worse. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. The moment his feet touched the pavement, James grabbed his arm and spun him around. "Hands behind your back." Michael froze. "Am I being arrested?" James smirked. "You're being detained." Michael's patience was running out. "On what grounds?" James leaned in close. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Suspicious vehicle, suspicious behavior." Michael let out a humorless laugh. "Suspicious how?" James ignored him and began patting him down, his movements rough and unnecessary. Michael gritted his teeth, but stayed still. Let him dig his own grave. Then, James reached into Michael's inside jacket pocket and pulled out a leather ID case. He flipped it open, expecting a driver's license. Instead, he was met with something that made his heart stop. A CIA badge. James' smirk vanished instantly. His face drained of color as his eyes darted between the badge and Michael's face. He slowly read the name aloud. Michael Davis, Deputy Director of Counterterrorism. Silence. James' mind raced. He had just handcuffed a top-ranking CIA agent. This wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. This was career suicide. Michael turned his head slightly. Now, officer, do you want to rethink what you just did? James stammered. But it was too late. The damage was done. Michael could have destroyed James' career right then and there. But instead, he had something else in mind. Something that would teach this officer a lesson he would never forget. And what happens next? That's where things take an even crazier turn. Officer James felt his hands go clammy as he stared at the CIA badge. His throat went dry. He had pulled over plenty of people before, and he had even made some arrests that were later questioned. But never in his wildest nightmares had he imagined arresting a top-ranking CIA agent. Michael Davis, on the other hand, remained perfectly calm. He had encountered dangerous criminals, terrorists, and foreign spies. Yet, standing here in the middle of the street, handcuffed by a cop who had let his own prejudice cloud his judgment, Michael had never felt a situation quite like this. James struggled to regain control of the moment. This ID, is it real? He asked, though his voice lacked the confidence he had just minutes ago. Michael turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Are you questioning the authenticity of a federal identification card, officer? James hesitated. If this man was truly CIA, then he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But backing down now would make him look weak. His pride refused to let that happen. I need to verify this, James said quickly, pulling out his radio. He fumbled to switch to the secure channel and called into dispatch. Unit 47, requesting ID verification on Michael Davis. There was a long silence. James shifted uncomfortably. His instincts told him this wasn't going to end well. A crackle came through the radio, followed by a voice. Unit 47, did you say Michael Davis? James gulped. Affirmative. Another long pause. Then, the response came back in a tone that made James' blood run cold. Stand by. Michael raised an eyebrow. That's your first smart decision today. James ignored him, but his hands tightened around the radio. He was hoping, praying, that somehow this was all a misunderstanding, that maybe the badge was fake, that maybe... The radio crackled again. Unit 47, you're holding Deputy Director of Counterterrorism, CIA. Release him immediately. Do not detain, do not question. Stand down. James' stomach dropped. Michael smiled slightly. Now, officer, do you still think I fit the description of a suspect? James' face turned red. He reached for the handcuffs with shaky hands, unlocking them quickly. Sir, I didn't know. Michael rubbed his wrists as the cuffs came off. You didn't ask either. You just assumed. James opened his mouth to defend himself, but what could he say? He had no excuse. Michael looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. You know, Officer James, I have two options right now. James swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming. A report to Internal Affairs. A lawsuit. A viral news story. His career was over. But Michael wasn't done speaking. I could call my team, file a formal complaint, and have you answering questions for the next 6 months. James nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. I understand, sir. Michael tilted his head. Or, I could give you the opportunity to fix this. Right here, right now. James blinked. What do you mean? Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. I don't believe in ruining people's lives over mistakes, but I do believe in accountability. And right now, you have a choice. You can pretend this never happened and walk away, or you can admit what you did, own up to it, and learn from it. James felt the weight of those words. He had spent years justifying his actions, telling himself he was just doing his job. But this moment, this humiliation, was forcing him to see what he had never wanted to acknowledge. For the first time in his life, Officer James faced the truth about himself. And what he did next, that was what truly shocked everyone. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The street was silent. Officer James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent years enforcing the law, yet in this moment, he realized he had been blind to his own biases. Michael Davis, the deputy director of the CIA, had every reason to end his career right then and there. But instead, he was giving him a chance, a rare opportunity to correct his mistake. Michael watched James carefully. Well, what's it going to be, officer? You want to pretend this never happened? Or are you ready to own up to your actions? James hesitated. His entire life, he had prided himself on being a tough cop, someone who never backed down. But right now, his authority meant nothing. He had been caught red-handed in an act of racial profiling, and there was no way to spin it. No excuse could change the facts. Slowly, he took a deep breath. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter than before. I made a mistake." Michael crossed his arms. "A mistake?" James clenched his jaw, forcing himself to continue. "I let my assumptions dictate my actions. I saw a black man driving an expensive car, and instead of treating you like any other citizen, I assumed the worst. And because of that, I overstepped my authority." Michael nodded, but his face remained unreadable. "And?" James exhaled, feeling a strange sense of relief as he spoke the words. "And I was wrong. I was wrong to stop you. I was wrong to detain you. And I was wrong to think I had the right to treat you differently just because of how you look." It was the first time in his entire career that James had admitted his bias out loud. It was uncomfortable, embarrassing, but in a strange way, it felt right. Michael studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You know, officer, I could report this. I could have your badge taken. I could make sure you never work in law enforcement again." James swallowed hard but nodded. "I understand." Michael took a step closer. "But tell me something. If I wasn't CIA, if I was just some ordinary guy, what would have happened to me?" James hesitated, but he knew the answer. He had seen it happen too many times. The wrongful arrests, the trumped-up charges, the people who didn't have the power to defend themselves like Michael did. If Michael had been just another black man, things could have gone very differently. "I don't know," James admitted, "but I know it wouldn't have been fair." Michael's expression softened slightly. "And that's exactly why this can't happen again." James felt something shift inside him. He had spent years believing that he was above this kind of thinking, that he wasn't one of those racist cops you saw on the news. But today had proved him wrong. Michael glanced down at his watch, then back at James. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to report this yet, but I am going to follow up. I'll be checking in, and I expect to see real change." James furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Michael gave a small smirk. "You think I don't have connections? I know your chief. I know your department. And if I find out you've gone back to your old ways, believe me, Officer James, your career will be over faster than you can say internal affairs." James nodded, his throat dry. "Understood." Michael extended a hand. "Then do better." James hesitated for a brief second before shaking it. It wasn't a handshake of friendship, it was a warning. As Michael walked back to his car, James stood there, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Shame, not just for what he had done to Michael, but for the countless others he had treated unfairly without even realizing it. And as he watched Michael drive away, one thought lingered in his mind. Would he ever truly deserve redemption? But little did he know, his real test was still yet to come. Stay tuned for what happens next, because this story is far from over. Officer James drove home in silence that night, replaying everything that had happened. The shame, the embarrassment, the realization that he had nearly destroyed his career over a split-second judgment. But the thing that weighed on him most was what Michael had said. What would have happened if he wasn't CIA? That thought stayed with him for days. He found himself reflecting on every traffic stop he had made, every time he had assumed someone was a threat before they even spoke. Had he arrested people simply because they looked suspicious? Had he justified his actions under the guise of protecting the community, when in reality, he had been feeding into stereotypes? The next week, James received an unexpected call from his chief. "My office." Now. His stomach dropped. Was this it? Had Michael decided to report him after all? When he arrived at the precinct, he found not only his chief waiting but Michael as well. The CIA agent sat calmly in a chair, watching him with that same unreadable expression. "Sit," the chief said. James did as he was told, his palms sweaty. "Sir, if this is about—" The chief held up a hand. "Michael told me everything. About the stop, the arrest, the mistake you made." James exhaled. "I take full responsibility." The chief leaned back in his chair. "Do you?" "Because Michael here didn't come to file a complaint. He came with an offer." James looked at Michael, confused. "An offer?" Michael nodded. "A chance to fix what you've broken. A chance to actually learn from this instead of just moving on like nothing happened." James frowned. "I don't understand." Michael sat forward. "You've spent years in law enforcement, but tell me, have you ever actually understood the people you police? Have you ever set foot in the communities you patrol outside of work? Have you ever tried to see things from their perspective?" James hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." Michael nodded. "That's what I thought. So here's the deal. You're going to spend the next 3 months working with a community outreach program. You're going to listen to the people you've arrested, the people you've pulled over, the people who don't trust cops like you. And you're going to learn what it feels like to be on the other side of that badge." James blinked in surprise. "You want me to, what? Work with ex-cons?" Michael smirked. "Some of them, yeah. Others are just regular people who have been victims of bad policing. People who don't see you as a protector, they see you as a threat. And if you're really serious about making a change, this is where you start." James sat back, processing it all. This was not what he expected. He had assumed Michael would either ruin him or let him off the hook. But this was something else entirely. The chief spoke up. "It's voluntary, James. But if you turn this down, you'd better believe I'll be watching you closely. And if you ever make another mistake like this, you won't get another chance." James took a deep breath. He had spent his entire career believing he was a good cop. But maybe being a good cop wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the people the law was supposed to protect. He met Michael's gaze and nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Michael stood up, extending a hand. "Then I'll see you next week." Over the next few months, James found himself in places he never thought he would be. Sitting in community centers, listening to the frustrations of black men who had been wrongly arrested, talking to families who had lost loved ones to police brutality, and even mentoring young kids who had grown up fearing the police. At first, it was uncomfortable. People didn't trust him, and frankly, he didn't blame them. He had to earn that trust. One evening, he sat in a small meeting room, listening to a young black man named Marcus describe his own wrongful arrest. He had been pulled over for a broken taillight, but instead of a ticket, he had ended up in handcuffs, accused of stealing his own car. James shifted uncomfortably. "What happened after that?" Marcus shrugged. "I spent the night in jail before they realized I wasn't the guy they were looking for. But by then, I had already missed a job interview. Lost the opportunity of a lifetime. And for what?" James felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he done something similar? How many times had he assumed guilt before innocence? By the end of the program, James wasn't the same officer he had been before. He no longer patrolled the streets looking for trouble. He patrolled them looking to help. He took extra time to talk to people instead of just questioning them. He stopped jumping to conclusions based on race or appearance. And most importantly, he called out his fellow officers when he saw them making the same mistakes he once had. One day, while on duty, James pulled over a young black man for speeding. The man looked nervous as James approached the window, gripping the steering wheel tightly. James saw the fear in his eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood it. "Afternoon," James said, keeping his tone calm. "You were going a little fast back there. You all right?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, just trying to get home from work." James studied him for a moment before nodding. "I get that. I'll tell you what, just slow it down, all right? Drive safe." The man blinked in surprise. "That's it." James smiled slightly. "That's it." As he walked back to his patrol car, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not in his badge, not in his authority, but in the fact that he was finally using his power the right way. A few weeks later, James received a text message from an unknown number. "Proud of you. Keep going. Michael." James smiled. He had been given a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. This wasn't just a lesson in justice. It was a lesson in humanity. Officer James' journey was more than just a mistake corrected. It was a wake-up call. He started as a cop who let his biases control his actions, but through humility, education, and self-reflection, he transformed into an officer who truly understood the meaning of justice. Michael Davis didn't just teach him a lesson, he changed his life. And because of that, James went on to change the lives of countless others. This story proves that redemption is possible, but only if we're willing to face the truth. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more eye-opening content.